that about right? Good. Some people talk about flying blind. I'm talking deaf because I couldn't hear a thing. I can never hear when things are coming out through a microphone. So therefore, I don't have the faintest idea of whether you can hear me. If you can, I hope. Because I wanted to tell you the sad, or strange, no, not sad, strange story of what it was like to be a nicely brought up girl pre-war who, when she started writing, found that she really could only write autobiographical stuff. And if you're writing autobiographical stuff, there's absolutely no point in doing it unless you try to get it as hard as you possibly can true. And you can never swear on the Bible that you're remembering things exactly as they were, but you must try. And so I happily, when my first book hit me, unexpectedly, started reconstructing things that had happened, and all that I thought about while I was writing it was it like this or was it like that? Did it happen in this way or did it not? And trying to get it as much like as possible. And the result was, of course, a book that had in it various things that had happened to me, which were an important part of my life and couldn't be left out. Things such as going to bed with one's young man when one's parents didn't know that you were doing such a thing. Going to bed with quite a lot of young men later on when things went wrong. Having an abortion. Having finished this book, and knowing that someone wanted to publish it anyway, someone in America did, I suddenly thought, what is my mother going to think? And I knew only too clearly what she was going to think, because we had been brought up in the same way, oddly enough. I was reviewing a book the other day by the Duchess of Devonshire, and she was describing their youth and how they were supposed not to talk about themselves, not to think about themselves, and how Nanny would say, if you were fussing about your appearance, who do you think is going to look at you? Even apparently one of them who was getting dressed to get married and was fussing a little bit about what I dressed like, Nanny said, oh, stop fussing, no one's going to look at you, dear. Our upbringing in other ways was very unlike the Mitfords, but that was a strong element. You mustn't expect anyone to want to know anything about you. You must not talk about yourself. You must never, it was boasting if you talked about yourself. It was something indecent about it. And actually, quite a lot of my family still feel rather like that, I know. One very dear cousin of mine, who I love, I know doesn't like the things I write. And finally, I found out why. We talked about it, and she said, well, you see, she writes herself a lot, but about subjects. She said, I simply can't understand how somebody I love can do something I die rather than do, which was write about one's private life. So I thought, now how am I going to get round this? And I had rather a sly thought. I thought, well, I'll let this man in America publish it, and then at least I will have a book in my hands published. And then I will show this book to my mother, which will prove that it's been approved of, that it's not horrifying that someone has published it. And I will say to her, I've written this book, here it is. If you really can't bear it, I won't get it published in England. So I got it published in America. I sent her a copy with a letter saying that. Silence. A week went by, not a word. Another week went by. I think in the end, 6 weeks went by and there had not been a word. And I was thinking, perhaps it didn't get there. Perhaps it got lost in the post. And then I thought, come on, pull yourself together, ring up and find out if she's had it. And I found I couldn't. I'd become completely frozen with sort of inhibition about it. I couldn't mention it to her. And then I thought, well, we're going next week to stay with my godmother together. We were going to be there. And I thought, I'll talk to her about it when we're at Aunt Phoebe's house. And we got to Aunt Phoebe's house, and I couldn't. I said to myself, well, I'm going to be driving her back to London in 2 days' time to stay with me for a night. I'll talk to her about it on the drive. And I couldn't. I simply couldn't. And then I thought, well, now what? And I thought, well, I've got to cook dinner, of course, so I can't talk to her about it yet, because I've got to cook dinner. I'll talk to her about it when I've cooked dinner. And the telephone rang. And she answered, and she said, Di, it's Andrew, that's my brother. He wants to talk to you. And I went to the telephone, and he said, Di, Ma is going to say to you she doesn't want you to publish that book. I've told her she was talking nonsense. Of course you've got to publish it. It's a bloody good book. Oh, the relief. And so I turned round. She knew what he'd been saying. And she said, oh, darling, Andrew thinks I oughtn't to ask you not to publish it. I suppose I oughtn't, ought I? I said, no, I think perhaps you oughtn't, really. Thinking, oh, strike while the iron is hot. And we sat down and we talked about it for the rest of the evening. And it was wonderful, because I found that there we were, two grown-up women talking about things that she actually knew really about. I mean, she may not have known the details, but she had a very clear idea of what had been going on. And it was perfectly easy for us to talk about it. And I thought, this is a wonderful, wonderful breakthrough. My mother and I have become two ordinary human beings in communication, which is wonderful. How lovely. And it made me feel very happy. And after that, she never spoke a word about the book. Not a single word. And I used to collect, the book came out in England, it did rather well, it had very nice reviews. I used to collect the reviews. I sent them to her to prove that other people didn't think it was horrifying or dreadful or anything. Not a word. Not a single word. And I, at that time, when I was young-ish, was horrified by this in a way. I thought how ridiculous it is, how hypocritical, how absurd. But you know, time has gone by, and it has now occurred to me that it was actually a technique of coping with life. And it worked, because you have a daughter. Your daughter does something that you love her very much. She does something you rather wish she hadn't done. You very much wish she hadn't done. Oh, well, all right, let's pretend she hasn't. And it works, you see. We had a perfectly happy life together for ages afterwards. I loved her dearly, she loved me. There was never any trouble between us. I never showed her any of my subsequent books, and she never wanted to read them. But they might not have been there, but we were perfectly happy together. And I think there's quite a lot to be said for the hypocrisy of that kind, if it's properly used. Because you can't, I mean, it's a curious thing, but why, I don't know, to this day, I don't know why I, the only member of my family, wanted to do this thing of writing about the inner things that had happened to one. It was odd, because I never said to myself, I am going to sit down and write this book. I was suddenly hit by some stories when I was quite old, really. And it was the year that Mr. Watt won the Grand National, whatever that was, because I had to submit a story to the Observer with a pseudonym, and I used him as a pseudonym, and the story won the Observer Prize, which was absolutely wonderful. And that made me think I could write. But I didn't sit down and think I'm now going to write about my sad love affair, which I had when I was young. It never occurred to my head that I would want to do such a thing. But the last of the stories I wrote wouldn't finish. And so I put it away and thought, that's that, I finished writing stories. And a year later, I came across it in a drawer, and I thought, well, I wonder if I could force it along and get it finished. Got my typewriter out, got some paper, put it in, and I started to write my first book. Like that, just it began. And it was the most extraordinary experience in my life, because I didn't know ever what my next... I used to come rushing back from work, dying to get on with writing it. I didn't know what I was going to be saying at all. I would read what I had written the day before, and it would go on. And it was a truly, deeply therapeutic experience, because I was writing about something horrible and sad that had happened to me, and that had really damaged my self-confidence quite badly. And although I'd had a perfectly happy life and been working in a job I adored and had a lot of fun, really, but at the bottom, I had always felt that I was a failure, because I'd not got the one thing I really wanted when I was young. I had not got married, I had not got children, the man I loved hadn't proved in the end not love me back enough. And that I felt was, in those days, that really was failure as a woman. And having got the story out, the sense of failure completely and totally vanished. And I've never felt it since. I was another person. And so I thought, oh, well, that's what writing does, but that's my sort of writing. It is obviously, writing for me is therapy. And the next two books I wrote were about terrible things that had happened, not to me, but to things I'd experienced and were distressing. And I wanted to get rid of them. And so I went back to the same thing of trying to reconstruct them as closely and accurately as I possibly could. And both times, it made me feel better. And then life became rather good. And horrid things, I didn't have anything happening to me that needed to be cured. I was having a lovely time, in fact. So I stopped writing. And I thought, that's that. That was obviously how I wrote. And fortunately, when I finished my life, when I was 80, well, just coming up to 80 years old, someone persuaded me to try and write something not as a therapy, but for fun. And rather diffidently, and not very optimistically, I started doing so. And lo and behold, it was possible. And so since then, I've written 3 books since I was 18. It's something I'm rather proud of, that. And because it's worked.